Hello everyone, before this video starts, I would appreciate if you guys would leave a like and subscribe, since your support means the world to me and allows me to make these types of videos. Now let's get into the video. I know I should have been ecstatic. My mother's eyes swam with gratitude, and yet mine were always cast to the ground, burning holes into crayon-ridden patches of carpet we refused to clean. We'd barely dared to dream during those silent dinners without Willow, the jarring sound of clumsy cutlery echoing through our now too empty house. Conversation seeming pointless, without her skipping around the dinner table, begging for the attention I gave her too little of, thumbs ghosting over my phone instead. I want to reach back in time and wrench my head from my shoulders when I think of her begging to show me a cartwheel, watching myself roll my eyes instead of grabbing her up and memorizing her face because she would be dead soon. Days of torture turned to weeks and Willow was gone, lost to some place only our terrible imaginations could conjure up. She was dead, but we were ghosts, haunting our own house with pale apparitions of ourselves, eating to live and speaking only to fill the silence. She was color, and the world redrew itself in black and white for the three of us. Life was over. Until it wasn't. The news she was missing had never really caught on outside the walls of our little town. So when the local policeman came to our doorstep, it was without fanfare. On the very first day she vanished, the officer leading the investigation found a small pair of gloves, her gloves, by the treacherous river that wound through the woods. To them, the investigation was over before it even began. No need to alert the press or sully the town with sad posters. The world chugged along without us, utterly unbothered, and we crumbled into thousands of pieces. But as the rain-soaked policeman uttered on a Tuesday evening, Willow had returned, found in a patch of woods, smeared with mud and blood, and asking to come back to our home. She led the police to this house, and as everyone yelled in unison, "She's back!" It's what my parents choked out in desperate, relieved sobs I'd never heard fill our house up before. It's what all the paperwork stated, endless days of making sure everything was above board. It seemed I was the only naysayer staring into this girl's eyes, and knowing with every fiber of my being that this was not my Willow sitting cross-legged on our family sofa. She looked like her, eerily so, but it was off, it was wrong. Her chin a little too pointy, her gaze a little too cold. She was not my bright, bubbly little sister dressed head to toe in pink, but she said she was. She said it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes which sparkled just a shade or two off Willow's. Her voice was a semitone lower, but that's because it's been 2 years and voices change, my mother insisted. Her chin-length hair now flowed far past her shoulders in that same chocolate hue, a length Willow would gasp at if she saw. This stranger wandered straight into our house, pulled on my sister's 2 small clothes and played pretend, pulling the strings on everyone but me. The first night was something out of a horror movie, the heaviest sense of dread settling like lead in my stomach. Bile rose into my throat as she skipped into the living room, settling herself in Willow's seat and tugging impatiently at the hem of my sister's favorite dress. I'd bought it for her on a spontaneous shopping trip, watching her eyes light up at all the little sunflowers lining the collar. She'd been giddy, and now a stranger's fingernails dug into the fabric, leaving marks I'd never get rid of. No longer would that little dress smell like Willow, because it was going to smell like her. "Come to the table," my mother insisted in a too jovial tone, eyes more alight than I'd seen them in years. My father nodded a silent agreement, perhaps a bit more muted than she was, and I had to swallow down my fury, my confusion. I had to. 6 eyes bore into mine, and the chair scraped as I sat down, and this wasn't my sister. She stared over her plate at me with a hollow smile, eyes devoid of any real emotion. Her fingers drummed on the mahogany, a disjointed rhythm I'd never heard despite sitting across from my sister for 9 years. "I missed you." Her words were sickly sweet, head tilted slightly to the side. Her gaze felt almost challenging, but my mother's eyes brimmed with tears as she nodded vigorously, fork hanging in midair. "Oh gosh, you wouldn't believe." She gulped her words down, overwhelmed. "You've dreamed of a family dinner, haven't you, love?" She regarded me almost desperately, fingers trembling. And I had, of course. I'd cried 1,000 tears for my baby sister. But the girl swinging her legs inches from mine, sitting in my sister's clothes, was not the girl I'd sobbed for. When her foot brushed mine accidentally, thousands of goosebumps erupted over my skin because it was new, wrong. "I'd love to hear where you've been," I dared whisper into the silence. My mother gasped, fork clattering noisily onto her plate. Mr. Matthews said, "Yeah, and if Willow ever turns up, I'll keep quiet about it," I snapped, eyeing this wild animal before me. She sucked in a mighty breath, and I swore I felt her gaze prickle me. But it was only seconds before her eyes became doe-like, wide and comical. "I don't want to talk about it," she uttered sadly, looking to my mother for reassurance. Her lip quivered, hands shook. It was almost laughable how overzealous her performance was, and yet my father admonished me, snapping at me to leave while my mother gathered up the intruder in her arms, clutching at her so she'd never leave. I watched the family before me, new and being invented before my eyes. As I left, she smirked right at me. Nobody believed me. Not on the second day when I walked in and saw her doing perfect cartwheels in the living room, something Willow had been utterly hopeless at. She must have learned, my mother chirped, scrubbing dishes so vigorously I swore she was leaving cracks. Nobody blinked on the third day when she locked herself in the bathroom and claimed to be too sick to head to the station to kickstart the rigorous medical testing. But it was the fourth night that haunted my dreams, driving me even closer to the edge I'd been dancing along. I'd largely managed to avoid her, other than the odd lingering gaze as we crossed paths in the hallway, or a wry smile as we brushed shoulders. Until there she was at 2 a.m., standing over me as I slept. I didn't scream, didn't startle her into dropping her soulless smile as she gazed upon me, staring straight down mere inches from my face. So close I could feel her hot breath on my nose, feel the animosity coming off her in waves. She didn't move when I clocked her, didn't take a step back or pretend to be doing anything other than pressing her face into mine in the dead of night. "Why are you here?" I whispered, and we both knew I meant more than standing in my room. She laughed, a little giggle I'd never heard leave Willow's mouth. "I wanted to come home, silly," she hissed back, breath tickling my cheek horribly. I swallowed, desperate not to show the fear which was beginning to course through me. "You aren't Willow." I gritted my teeth, and only then did she pull back a little, mock hurt lining her features. "That's a shame," she frowned. "You're my favorite big sister." My hands trembled under the covers. "And how many sisters have you had?" She paused then, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Oh, lots." I don't think I've ever felt as unsafe in my life as I did in that moment, watching her eyes glimmer with something truly evil, a sick sort of pride. I didn't find my voice for a long time, but when I did, it was small and timid, a shadow of my confidence from only hours earlier. "And what do you want with us?" She thought on it for a moment, tilting her head back and forth as though the question was funny. Even in the dark, she looked wrong, as though someone had built her to look like my beloved Willow and misremembered her slightly, getting the angles and details wrong. She lay her fingers on my forehead, painfully drumming that same pattern on my skin as all those days ago. Shamefully, I was too scared to move, even as her fingers jammed into my skull. "I like your mom," she mused, giggling childishly as she caught her mistake. "Our mom. I think she's going to like me more than your sister." But before I could react, she was gone, skipping towards the door in the wrong night clothes, only turning back to casually ruin my life. "She's dead, by the way," she murmured into the silence, shrugging. "It was painful, too. Sorry for your loss." And she left, leaving me aghast as I festered in my blanket, desperately grabbing Willow's teddy bear from beside my bed and clutching it to my chest. I sobbed myself to sleep that night, face buried in her favorite toy and knowing for sure that she was never coming home. It only got worse. One day, I came home and my father wouldn't speak, only managing to stare at his new daughter as she smirked at him from the shadow of Willow's bedroom. He startled at me in the hallway, scurrying back into his study. When I called for him, he shook his head. "Hang out with your friends. Go back outside," he'd ordered, voice cracking. He slammed the door behind him, and that was that. I was left to stare into Willow's room, locking gazes with a pair of empty eyes sneering at me from under the bed. dark shadows only giving me a glimpse at her little limbs, all cracked at the wrong angles, as she twisted herself to fit where she shouldn't. When I tried to speak to my mother, she grew more and more irate, once physically covering my mouth with her hand. "Mum, please see that she isn't who she—" But she muffled my words out of existence with a trembling hand, sending me a subtle no with a quick shake of the head. She pleaded towards me with her eyes, but I realized quickly that her steely gaze had fallen behind me. I didn't need to see the parasite in my peripheral to feel her gaze burning holes into the back of my head. And I wasn't imagining it. My mother was fearful, finally turning back to me with a steely resolve. "Everything is fine," she murmured, speaking 1,000 words with only her eyes and voice dropping to a whisper. "We will make it work." That night, the stranger wearing my sister's favorite bracelet gleefully pushed a piece of paper to the center of the dinner table, eyes lit up with glee. "I drew us!" she cried, greedily watching for our reactions. My mother gave nothing away, only visibly swallowing as she drank in the paper, white-knuckled grip on her spoon. My father stood from his seat, striding from the table and slamming the front door behind him as he left us, perhaps for the last time. I, however, dared pick it up, regarding every horrific line and frantic scratching before me. It was us, except the people labeled Mummy and Daddy were standing without heads, rivers of blood dripping down their torn torsos. My double sat in the corner of the paper, a pair of gouged-out eyes lying on the floor next to my terrified frame. Our stranger stood smiling with a large rake in her hand, head bent to the side and wearing my sister's dress. But somehow, worst of all, was the picture of a little girl crumpled in the corner, a frown etched upon her face. Willow, the scrawl above her, stated, and I could hardly bear it. I don't remember much of it now, just the screaming and crying, lifting whatever wasn't nailed down and hurling it across the room, watching it splinter into 1,000 pieces. My mother cradling me as she dragged me upstairs, letting me bawl into her familiar sweet-smelling cardigan, clutching her as though she'd leave me too. The swirling wrongness engulfing our house, swallowing us back into the clutches of grief. But my all-encompassing comfort disappeared, because when that horrible little thing downstairs called a desperate mummy, my mother went rigid. "You don't have to go," I pleaded through bleary eyes, but her sad smile told me that she did. "I prayed 2 years for my baby girl to come home," she'd said in a thick voice, clutching my hands as if begging me to understand. I'll always wish I tried harder to keep her in that room with me, because the moment I loosened my grasp, I sealed her fate. The thing downstairs called and she offered me a sad smile, fingers brushing mine before she disappeared through the darkness of the door. I never saw her again. Before my eyes closed and sleep claimed me, I saw the head of Willow's beloved bear discarded on the floor across the room, 3 feet from its body. My heart sank into my stomach and I drifted off into nightmares, feeling somehow it was all over. When I awoke, slick with sweat and dread, she was there in the darkest corner of my room, almost Willow. Nighttime shrouded her, but I could see the blood, even in the dim light. Something glinted in her hand under the glow of moonlight, and her eyes blazed with something bigger than the both of us. 12 minutes passed, and she didn't move, her relentless, empty stare locked onto me as she swayed back and forth. I knew that the second I moved, she was going to lunge. Somehow, I knew that's what Mum did. That's why the room fell into such uneasy silence, because I was utterly alone, and when I held my breath, I swore could I hear the shift of fabric. Yes, she was definitely closer to me than she had been 5 seconds ago. If I squinted, I could see her feet shuffling towards me, in time with my erratic breathing. I ran, of course, limbs jelly as I sprinted past my parents' room, practically choking on the stench of blood. She locked all the doors, sealed all the windows. I don't even remember how I made it to the hospital, sodden and picking glass out of my skin as a kind nurse led me to a room, concern etched into her features as she promised to return for me as soon as she called the police. It's hard to type with blood trickling down my phone, fragments of the upstairs window jammed into my flesh. It's over, I'm sure, but somehow with every second that passes, I feel closer to my sister, the real one. Not the one with her face pressed into the third-story window of my hospital room, face contorted in bloody, evil glee. Thank you for watching the video fully. Please hit the like and subscribe button, since I could not make these videos without your support, and it means the world to me.